we're just we're just so thankful, as we are always, about we come before you with a recognition of your majesty and power and grace, but most of all your love, Lord, that you loved us so much that you sent your only Son to be a reconciliation for us with you and with eternity, but also with our Christian brothers and sisters. And so we try to work to try to bring more people into the fold, of course, if we can, and because we do realize that's such an important issue. We thank you for tonight. I don't know much about the Colson program, but I certainly know the name, and I can't imagine that it's not something which is really valuable. Christian worldview is a very important thing, and it's increasingly more important for our society these days. We need a new way to look at things, and we have sort of forgotten the old. So I look forward to hearing Paul talk about that. Thank you for the people who are here. May the technology run exactly as we wanted, and may everything that we say and do, Lord, bring glory and honor to your name. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Okay,
So
let's go ahead and get started.
yeah, not seeing Jeff, I guess I will do my own introduction.
Yeah.
Probably no one can do it.
This is Paul.
What was that?
Paul, this is
Yes.
Mary. Paul, this is Mary. I know nothing about the Colson Center, so do
Yes.
not start like everybody knows. Okay, I really would have.
No, right. No. So I'll explain that. So just hold. So let me just start by, so Millie could probably do this, but I will do it. So, yep, you see by my label on the screen there, Paul Atkinson. So I'm from Columbia, South Carolina originally. I went to Wofford College in Spartanburg, South Carolina Liberal Arts School, and got a degree in pre-med chemistry. And then I went to medical school in Charleston, South Carolina, the Medical University of South Carolina. While I was there, towards the my third year medical school, I met Millie, who was working as a nurse. I graduated in 1980 and got married in 1980. And then I did 5 years of anatomic and clinical pathology residency in Charleston. After that, I was hired. Pathologists have to be hired. They can't just hang out a shingle like some practitioners. And I was hired by the pathology group at Northside Hospital here in Atlanta, where I worked for 34 years. I retired 3 years ago, and I completed this Colson Fellowship just this recent spring. So I'm going to start sharing in a second here. Let's see. I'm going to start sharing my screen. So I know Andrea told me you should have set up so everybody could share. And here's what I want to share. Okay, I hope you guys can see that. Says you can. You can see. Okay.
Yes, I can see it.
Good. I'm going to put on slide. Okay. So this is the title for tonight: Colson Fellows Program, Developing a Comprehensive Christian Worldview. Jeffrey asked me, having known that I was completing this program, if I would take one of the slots for the summer program. And this is my plan for this evening, so you'll know. It's basically in three parts. First, I'm going to talk about the program itself. Second, I'm going to give you some excerpts about worldview from a teaching practicum I did, which was something I did in our Sunday school class. I'm supposed to tell you that Millie and I are members of at Mount Bethel Church, formerly Mount Bethel UMC, where we've been active members there since 1988. Okay, so the worldview intro, and then finally, Jeffrey really wanted me to give some of my personal takeaways from the program itself. So if you would, please hold your comments and questions to the end so I can try to make sure I probably have more material than I can get through, but I will adjust as I see the time go by. So let's see. So my route to becoming a Colson Fellow, and this is the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, is the organization. You see the website, colsoncenter.org. Started in May of 2019. Millie, who at that time I was in the last few months of my working, and Millie at the time was and still is a very active podcast listener. And because she listened to the Breakpoint podcast that is put out by John Stonestreet, the president of the Colson Center, at least 5 days a week. Actually, he does a weekend one too. She knew that there was going to be a special event that they have annually called the Wilberforce Weekend. It was taking place in the Washington, D.C. area, and she saw that there were going to be some good speakers there. There was a special event with Eric Metaxas going to interview John Lennox, other speakers. Andrew Peterson was going to actually not only perform, but speak about creativity for Christians. So we went. And when I was there, what I found was, not knowing much about this organization, I found lots of people who had either completed this program they call the Colson Fellows Program, or who actually there for their, what you might call graduation, they call commissioning. And there were several hundred people that were there for that commissioning. And everybody that I spoke to, which was actually across a wide range of ages, and that was something that impressed me, said, oh, this is something you should definitely do. So I did it, but I waited a couple of years to do it. So Chuck Colson on the left, maybe many of you remember who he was. He was probably most famously known, certainly at one time, for being Nixon's hatchet man, right? He was a Marine at one time, then a lawyer, and then he worked in the Nixon administration and actually ended up going to prison, in a prison in Alabama, for something related to, well, it was obstruction of justice, I believe, and it was related actually to the Pentagon Papers, and something he did related to that. Before he went to prison, somebody he knew shared with him the book Mere Christianity, and he became an evangelical Christian before he went to prison. That conversion actually is viewed with some cynicism by the media, still is probably, and they think that he did that simply to try to lessen his sentence and that sort of thing. Of course, his life after that tells us a different story, because he certainly turned around his life. While in prison, he obviously noticed what it was like there, and he ended up starting a program called Prison Fellowship, which still exists, to improve conditions in prison, also bring the gospel to those who are incarcerated. He had a real passion for Christian worldview, and that people would know what Christian worldview is, especially believers, and they would be able to express that the truths of the Christian worldview to other people. So he started the program called Colson Fellows Program.
Paul, I hate to interrupt, but could you press the button up at the top that says play from current slide? We'll make it easier for everybody to see.
Okay, let's see.
It's the second from the left.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, okay. Do I need to reduce the size of that screen? Okay, it's pretty big. Okay, so yeah, that is big. Okay, so anyway, Chuck Colson died in 2012, actually not long after that Wilberforce weekend, and John Stonestreet, the guy on the right, became the president. He has a degree in Bible from Bryan College in Chattanooga, Tennessee, I think. Then he studied something related to Christian thought at Trinity Evangelical University in Deerfield, Illinois. He worked for Summit Ministries for a while, teaching youth about apologetics and Christian worldview. And then now he's the president of the Colson Center for Christian worldview. Okay. The only thing about that view is now my slides are not visible. My notes aren't visible to me, but okay. I'll try to remember what I told myself I needed to say. The program is described as a 10-month deep dive into Christian worldview.
Paul, put it back the way that it works for you. I'm sorry.
Let me just, that's okay. How about, but what if I made it bigger? Does that help?
No.
That doesn't do anything for you
No,
guys?
everybody can make their screen bigger or smaller themselves. You can't
I don't
control the
know.
size. Everybody individually can control the size.
Does that help any? Now you're seeing my view, right?
No.
Okay, let's go back.
That's, just leave it like that.
That's fine. You can leave it that way. We can all see it
Okay.
just fine.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I shouldn't
That's
I
okay.
shouldn't
Yeah,
have
I
tried
understand.
to help.
No, right. So it's about it. It's a program that involves reading. I read about 14 books. I watched a lot of videos. There's one twice a month webinars, usually with authors of the books that we read. There's a once a month program in person. I met from 9 till 3 on one Saturday every month down at Church of the Apostles. There's different ways you can do the program. Originally, it was mostly online, and people didn't really meet in person very much. But they started the format they call a local cohort, which now is what we have in Atlanta. And that was just begun a couple of years ago. I actually met the guy at that Wilberforce weekend back in 2019 who was starting it. And the reason it's at Church of the Apostles is that's where he goes to church. But they also have, and it's really a very good format, the local cohort. They have some that are church-based. Now they are becoming very supportive of Christian schools and education. That's a current theme in the Colson Center overall. I think there's scholarships for people who teach in Christian schools. They estimate it takes about 10 hours a week, 8 to 10 hours a week. I never kept track of that. I never had to since I was retired. I will tell you, it's designed, as it says on their own website, for people who are working to be able to do it. And about half the people that, or many of them, about half the people that were with me were working. And overall, a lot of people were working. And then there were, so it has these different divisions during the course of the year of different themes. First, you're studying worldview in general, and particularly biblical worldview, then culture. And then the third quarter, it's flashpoints in culture from a worldview perspective. So at this time, you're reading about things like human sexuality, including things like gay marriage and abortion, technology, social justice, race relations, those sorts of things. And the last quarter is designed with the idea, it says forming a cultural response. That means from you, the fellow in training, and that's the way you refer to this, a fellow in training. There were 21 people with me that started doing it. One died of COVID in December, unfortunately. And then another guy, a little bit older guy, dropped out mainly because he was working with some mission project that needed his help. So 19 of us completed the program. It's a growing program. 750 people did it overall in the country last year. They have some international cohorts, Australia, I think maybe Thailand, some in Europe. There's 40 people doing it this year in Atlanta, the upcoming year. So colsonfellows.org. I was in the 17th year of the program. There's maybe 3,000 people that have completed the program. So you can see with 750 doing it last year and maybe 3,000 total, it's growing. By the way, Chuck Colson originally called it the Centurion program, which probably came from his years as a Marine. The sort of major outcomes that are the goals of the program are that you would have spiritual and intellectual transformation. You'd have a clear vision and purpose. So there's part of the program developed towards having a personal mission plan. They want you to develop practical skills and wisdom, understanding a Christian worldview, and then insight into what the Bible calls vain philosophies and false ideas. And finally, then once you are finished with the program and you're commissioned, you're sent off to do things. I'll talk about that in a minute. There's a powerful network of people who have done it. And so once you're in the program, you're in the program. There's several things that you're supposed to do to finish. One of them is, besides completing all the readings and watching the videos, is teaching something related to worldview to other people. I did mine in a 5-week Sunday school plan where I started off with a lesson on worldview, then culture, and then 3 of the books that I read, I did summaries of those. And finally, the thing they call the capstone is a 3-year plan. They want you to develop a 3-year ministry plan. They're very flexible about this, but the idea is that you don't graduate and call it quits. You've been commissioned, you're being sent out to do things. So just to share what mine is like, well, I'll tell you that there was a lady from the year before me whose 3-year mission plan was take the first year to figure out what her 3-year mission plan was. There was one of the older guys in my group said his 3-year plan was to survive for 3 years. My 3-year plan, obviously most of them are much more serious. Mine includes, actually, I'm going to be a leader in this year's fellows program in Atlanta. I'm going back to Bible Study Fellowship to be participating in the children's program there. And maybe someday I'll be, depending on what happens at our church, teaching classes on worldview there. So colsonfellows.org, you can find a lot more information about the program there. It starts in July, and our Atlanta program is full for this upcoming year, but I would encourage any of you who are interested to do more research. Feel free to contact me. I'll be happy to answer any of your questions. Okay, so I'm going to transition now to some excerpts from the first class I did on my teaching practicum, which I said was done for my Sunday school class, Worldview 101, Towards a Biblical Worldview. By the way, in the world of worldview, this biblical, some people like to use biblical worldview. Some people like to use Christian worldview. They have reasons, specific reasons for preferring one over the other. I use them, like a lot of people, sort of interchangeably. 2 of the books that we read related to just worldview in general was one on the left is called Making Sense of Your World. One of the authors is, John Stonestreet, and also William Brown. Bill Brown was the president of Cedarville University at the time that book came out. And now he is retired. He is in charge of the curriculum for the Colson program. The second book there on the right, How Now Shall We Live by Chuck Colson, written also with Nancy Piercy, originally from 1999. I think there was another edition that came out maybe 10 years later. I actually had the earlier edition. I'd read it in the past, so I read it again. And in that book, Chuck Colson takes you through what a biblical worldview is, or Christian worldview, working through the 4 stages, which I will tell you more about in a minute, but creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. There is another book that we also read, sort of general background of worldview, and it was more of a history book by Dr. Glenn Sunshine called Why You Think the Way You Do. Like I said, he was a history professor in Connecticut. And so that sort of traces worldview starting back in time in history and works its way up towards the present. He's now working with Ken Boa, by the way, since he retired from teaching. So worldview in English is actually the English version of a German word. That's where it was apparently first used by the philosopher Immanuel Kant in the late 1790s. It's Weltanschauung, which means literally worldview. And he was using the word in the sense of sensory perception. Since then, as people have, as sort of the whole idea of worldview has evolved, it's changed to be more of not sensory perception, but more of a philosophical slant on things. 19th century German philosophers had a lot to write about worldview. And there's a lot, and then of course, currently, plenty of Christian authors especially have written a lot about worldview. And then you can get Dr. Albert Mohler's, he's taken a break during the summer, but his podcast is one where he evaluates the news from a Christian worldview, is the way he describes it. So what's a worldview? Well, there's been, I read a number of really detailed, complicated definitions, but just in sort of easy way to understand it, it's basically the way that you look at the world and life, kind of like the way you're looking through colored lenses or prescription glasses or contact lenses. So it's the lens through which we interpret reality and by which we reason, and it can be expressed as a story, and the Christian worldview is expressed as a story. So one of the things to note is, just like your glasses maybe, or your contact lenses, you can have the wrong prescription. The truth about worldview is that everybody has one, whether they realize it or not. And actually, whether they consider themselves religious or not, just about everybody's worldview is actually based on a type of religion, whether they recognize it or not. Or most people don't know what their worldview is, actually. They just go about their life and process things and behave in certain ways. And you can detect some things about their worldview from what they do and what they say. Once you've studied worldview, it's actually sort of a bit of a game to try to do that. So not all worldviews are the same, but there is a distinct Christian worldview. And by the way, I don't know if Jeffrey's gotten on yet, or I don't see him right on my screen, but Jeffrey teaches a class in worldview, which Amelia and I have taken.
Yeah, Paul, I'm on.
Oh, good. Okay, great, Jeff. So this is, I have some diagrams that I took from Bill Brown's book that he wrote with John Stonestreet. So if you look at this pyramid, you'll see that the idea is that from your worldview come your values and then your behavior. So as you think, so you do, as the Bible tells us, and that's basically what this is saying as well. An interesting aspect of worldview is that a lot of it may be beneath the surface. We may not recognize what we see or what people do. That's observable. We may not know exactly what their values are or their beliefs, and or what their worldview is, whether they recognize it or not. But behavior is a definite clue. And then when people start speaking about what they believe, then you get a lot of clues from that as well. Unfortunately, a fair number of people live backwards. They they start by adopting a behavior, oftentimes from what is culturally acceptable or preferred. And from that, they derive their values. And then from that comes their worldview. So they're actually living life backwards. I think you can probably imagine how easily that could happen. You know, you watch the movies and TV and that kind of thing. And from that comes your values. The source of the biblical worldview, the authority for biblical worldview, is the Word of God. So I put this quote in here from, I don't remember this being specifically cited in any book that I read, but it seemed like a good one to me, since for a Christian, you want to have a true worldview, an accurate worldview. And of course, this is where Jesus is being interrogated by Pilate. And he says, "For this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everybody on the side of truth listens to me." And Pilate asks, "What is truth?" But apparently doesn't wait around for the answer, which is unfortunate, because the author of truth personified, could have answered his question for him right there. So when you're thinking about worldview, all worldviews should be considered by asking them certain questions. How do they answer these questions? Here's the questions that the way Chuck Colson frames them. How or where did we come from? Which from a Christian worldview is creation. What's gone wrong with the world? Because I think just about everybody realizes that the world is not perfect. There's problems. Even materialists realize that things aren't. Maybe they don't have any answer for this question, but they do recognize that bad things can happen. So why is that? What can we do to fix it? Well, in the biblical worldview, God fixed it for us through redemption, through the work of Jesus Christ. And how shall we live? The answer for that is that God is making all things new. Of course, he is going to restore the end of time, end of earth time. There's going to be a massive restoration project, but the worldview that is stressed, this aspect of the worldview is heavily stressed, as I'll mention more in the Colson Center, is that this process is already at work. God is already making all things new. The kingdom of heaven is at hand, as Jesus proclaimed, especially in the Gospel of Matthew. Another way of looking at these questions that could be asked of any worldview are origin, identity, who are you? Which for a Christian, the answer is made in the image of God. Imago Dei. What's the meaning of your existence? For some, there's no meaning. Some worldviews, in a biblical worldview, your meaning is derived from God. God gives you meaning and purpose in your life. That's where you find your meaning. Where does your morality come from? Everybody has a morality, a sense of right or wrong. Of course, C.S. Lewis makes a big point. This was one of the first readings actually that we had to do, was to read Mere Christianity. And everybody has a morality, and we can make the moral argument for the existence of God. That's where we derive our morality. It's from God, from his law, from his righteousness, his holiness. And what's our destiny? Well, for believers, it's life in the eternal presence, or eternal life in the presence of God. For non-believers, it's eternal life not in the presence of God, away from the presence of God. Another way of looking at this is, of course, here's again these the questions about creation, fall, redemption, restoration. Here's a timeline. Actually, an interesting thing to contemplate is, what do you think that this doesn't say in the Bible? What is how long after creation did the fall occur? Doesn't actually say. I've got into some discussions with people about that. But we do know something about the time frame of when Jesus was incarnate on this earth, fully God and fully man. And then at the end, Jesus will come back. The question we need to ask ourselves is, what time is it? Where do we live in time? Well, we don't know exactly where in that, along that x-axis, we'll say, is our time or our cultural moment. That's a big phrase for the Colson Fellows program. What's going on around us in our culture at this time, our cultural moment. But what we can say is we're between redemption and ultimate restoration. So critical to the biblical worldview is the Imago Dei, that all people have been created in the image of God, as it says in Genesis 1:27, created man in his own image, in the image of God, he created him. Not only that, he created them male and female. And then, so unique to humanity is that all people are divine image bearers. This would be true of the best person you can think of, and would be true of maybe the worst, like say Hitler or Stalin. Those people had the image of God within them. Everybody, in all of us, the image of God has been tarnished by the fall, but we still bear that image. So this is why, as George reminded us last week, C.S. Lewis wrote that you've never met an ordinary person, because everybody is an image bearer. And if you are pro-life, you believe that about the unborn as well. So here's some statistics related to problem about worldview. I think actually Bruce sort of referred to this in his prayer. I got some of these statistics, by the way, from reading Natasha Crane's book, which wasn't assigned. It's called
Faithfully Different.
That's right. Thank you. Faithfully Different. But I read it towards the end and used some of this material when I was speaking to a book club. So according to Pew Research in 2019, if you just ask people whether they're Christian or not, 2/3 of Americans in that poll said they were. That doesn't mean they are, but that's how they answered the question. Now, if you start looking at actual behavior and what people say they believe. So this is the next two statistics here from Arizona Christian University from 2020. So 6% of Americans answered questions in a way that showed they had a biblical worldview. The number drops significantly for millennials. So Norman Geisler, who was a theologian and very interested in Christian worldview, founder of the Southern Evangelical Seminary in Charlotte, wrote that, or said that if Christianity is to survive, worldview education is no longer an option, it's an absolute necessity. So I think that's probably a strongly supported by the Areopagus as well, right? Jeff, yes, I'm getting a nod. We have that plot. We take that to be true. This is another little chart that shows three sort of basic types of worldview, and we're not going into differentiating all of these, but just notice that there's Christianity is not the only theistic religion or worldview. Islam and Judaism are. I don't know how they got polytheism in there. It's in another graph I have. It's located under pantheism, but or somewhere else. But anyway, so pantheism. This is like Hinduism or Buddhism. What Jeffrey teaches is Eastern monism. These people believe that God exists, but not as a person, an entity, that God is in nature, not that God created nature. And then we have various forms of atheism, which interestingly in this chart included sexual revolution, which we spent a lot of time studying, I'll say, but I didn't realize that it was like inherently atheistic, but certainly when you start thinking about some of the tenets of the sexual revolution, it is certainly the leaders of it. Now, don't be alarmed by this graph. The thing this, by the way, this has been called by some of my colleagues as the eye chart because it's so detailed. So don't try to read, stay up there with the big E. Don't go down to the bottom and read the 2015 level. Just notice that ultimate reality can be divided into the worldviews that characterize it and consider ultimate reality as knowable, which was probably just about everybody up until relatively recently in time, because the only chart that comes off of that only group is postmodernism, which is very prevalent nowadays, right? The people that believe there's no absolute truth, but that's relatively recent in time. And so we have, after that, you can divide it up after knowable ultimate reality into those who describe the ultimate reality as either just purely physical, which would be naturalists. Richard Dawkins would be in that category. Spiritual, but not a personal God, transcendentalists, Buddhists, Hindus, personal God, like Christians. So I'm going to just speak about briefly about a couple of these other worldviews. We're familiar with, hopefully, with Richard Dawkins, the biologist, likes to say bad things about and critical things about Christians, especially. He doesn't believe in God. There is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So there's no purpose to your life. You just came out of the muck, and to the muck you will go. But in between, especially for people who are sort of leaning toward kind of humanist philosophies, humanist views, but also naturalists at the same time, they sort of paradoxically exalt man, but at the beginning and the end, man's really totally insignificant. And then Carl Sagan. Maybe some of you remember watching Cosmos. I certainly do. Millie and I watched that in the 80s every week. He would begin, he's an astrophysicist, he's since died. The cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be, he said every week. So notice there's no beginning or end in that. I guess the Big Bang was a problem for him. Now, secularism, again, this is from Faithfully Different by Natasha Crane. Another book that sort of kind of relates to this kind of thing that we read was Another Gospel by Alyssa Childers. She mostly focuses on, Alyssa Childers focuses on progressive, so-called progressive Christianity and how she found herself immersed in that and used Christian apologetics to work her way out, fortunately. This material right here is from Faithfully Different by Natasha Crane. Secularism, and so secularism, of course, is opposed to religion, but apparently there are people who consider themselves secularists that haven't totally abandoned the spiritual. It's just that their idea of God cannot be somebody who is their lawgiver. It has to be something quite vague. So the authority is in the self rather than the authority of any given religion or its gods. And she says that secularism has become the cultural air in which we believe, in which we live and breathe. It's everywhere. You can't escape secularism. Now, as George would be quick to tell us, secular neutrality is a myth. So people who hold to this secular worldview want to claim that from the standpoint of, for example, separation of church and state, that religion such as Christianity needs to be quite separate. There needs to be a fixed, hard and fast wall between the two. But secularism is neutral, and that's not really right, because secularism is a religion unto itself. So as I mentioned up front, virtually every worldview is really a religion. Or as I heard somewhere the other day, everybody is a theologian, whether they know it or not. So here's 4 secular statements that you've probably heard a lot. Feelings are the ultimate guide. Happiness is the ultimate goal. Judging is the ultimate sin, unless they're judging people who are Christian, because we don't have a right to judge, but they do, but that's not really judging. They're just proclaiming the truth, I guess. And for those people that might have a bent towards some spirituality, God's the ultimate guess. You can't be sure. There's no way to know. So this is a quote from, it's a little long, it's on 2 slides, but it's from Chuck Colson. And it actually in some form was in his 1999 edition of How Now Shall We Live, which, by the way, the title itself is a takeoff from a book that Francis Schaeffer wrote years before. I think it was How Shall We Live Now, or then, How Shall We Live Then? But anyway, and then he repeated it, this statement, Chuck did in podcasts. He used to do the Breakpoint podcast, or actually before they were podcasts, they were radio spots. We live in a culture that is at best morally indifferent, a culture in which Judeo-Christian values are mocked. Immorality is not only ignored, but it's rewarded. People are looking for answers, but they're unable to see that they are the natural products of a culture that has rejected the Christian worldview and instead embraced moral relativism and personal autonomy as the great goods of modern life. We Christians simply must be able to explain and to defend this truth. Only Christianity offers a comprehensive worldview that covers all areas of life and thought. Only Christianity offers a way to live in line with the real world. And so Chuck Colson was quite passionate about that idea that we must be able to explain and defend this idea that Christianity offers a comprehensive worldview, the only one that answers the questions that we talked about earlier. And for that, he started the Colson Fellows program. Now, let's see, I've left some time here for some takeaways. I know Jeffrey wanted me to spend some time talking about takeaways from the program. What did I learn? What did I get out of it? A lot of things. And so I'm going to touch on some of them. So as I sort of mentioned when we're talking about creation, fall, redemption, restoration, the Christian story, the when we go to church, it seems to me we often hear a heavy emphasis on fall and redemption. We're reminded that we're sinners and we need a savior, and that God has provided a savior through the work of Jesus Christ. And that's good. But really what the Colson Fellows program focuses quite a bit on, I mean, of course, it recognizes what I just said is true, and we study that to a certain extent, but what its real focus is on understanding creation, how God created things originally, humans as image bearers of God, humans as being originally very good, creation as being originally very good when Adam and Eve were created, that God made humanity with a purpose. And of course, it's fallen, but God has a plan after redemption for restoration that is already taking place. And in that, in understanding creation and restoration, we can understand our identity and our purpose. And having done that, then we can find our personal role in playing a role in God's restorative work in this world. And that's where the 3-year mission plan is focused. So another takeaway is that humanity in the 21st century is in an identity crisis. We didn't actually read a specific book that talked about this, but we did have some videos and webinars that did. So what does it mean to be human? We're struggling with that idea right now. We didn't read Carl Trueman's book, which I think spends a lot talking about this rise and triumph of the modern self. But I do know that on the curriculum for the current year, starting right now, they're reading the shorter version, thankfully perhaps, called Strange New World, which will, I'm sure, discuss this idea of the identity crisis that we are dealing with. So here's something. So I shamelessly borrowed a few memes from the Weekend Pictures, and you can see Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson with this terrible dilemma of what is a woman? Can she define what a woman is? And I do believe that Justice Jackson passed 7th grade biology, wherein she would have learned that, well, a really good definition would have been someone with XX chromosomes.
Paul,
Yes.
you need to copyright that slide.
Yeah, well, I didn't make it. I borrowed it. I said shamelessly borrowed from the Weekend Pictures from the Powerline blog. There's a lot of really instructive, entertaining, and also instructive memes that I get from that site. Now, I believe that she knew the answer. The problem was that she couldn't say the answer because her objective definition would have been in conflict with the subjective definitions that are supported by the people who wanted her to be a Supreme Court justice. And so she refused to answer, said she wasn't qualified. Of course, that's the ultimate appeal of people whose sort of little g God is the state, is to appeal to experts. But I don't believe you have to be a real expert in biology to answer that question. Now, we did spend some time talking about culture. So remember, that was like the second phase of the year. First was worldview, introduction, and then culture. And culture is actually what humans make of the world. There's a cultural mandate that goes back to Genesis, where after God had created Adam and Eve, he actually told them to fill the earth and to maintain the garden. I've got my light off here. I can't quite see the exact words, but to they're given a culture. So culture is what humans make of the world. It could be good, but unfortunately, it can also be bad. So we create culture And then culture circles back around and affects us. Christianity is, oh, I know, is it be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, and then rule over the animals. So that's the cultural mandate given to humans. Christianity is countercultural, and increasingly so, I guess you might say. But it's supposed, throughout history, it should have been countercultural, and we can forget that ourselves. So the example they give from 1980 looks like sort of I would call a punk kind of guy. But in 2022, countercultural is a family with a father and a mother, a husband and a wife, and a child. That's countercultural. One thing that I learned was that human sexuality is a lot more complex than I originally believed or had thought. So obviously, human sexuality is a biological issue, as we just sort of discussed. In Christianity, particularly Protestant churches, human sexuality is often defined in moral issues, moral laws, rules, what's right and wrong. But I learned that human sexuality can be expressed as theological. One of the books I read was based on, it's actually something that John Paul II wrote, a long thing that he wrote called Theology of the Body. And the book that I read that was a way of making it more easy to understand was called Our Bodies Tell God's Story. And basically, just to summarize a couple of key points on that, is that the fact that we're created male and female and able to come together in a biological union is actually representative of the fellowship, the relationship of the Trinity. And this carries on also into the idea that marriage is described in Ephesians, I think chapter 3. Paul goes, first he's talking about that passage on submission in marriage. But for a moment, he deviates and he says something about how he's talking about Christ and the church. And then he comes back to the marriage. And so marriage is theologically related to the relationship between Christ and the church and the wedding supper of the Lamb. And another thing I read, which was not an assignment but recommended, was this essay by Roger in 2013, published in the American Conservative, called Sex After Christianity. I don't know, Jeff, have you ever read that?
No, I have not.
Well, you should read it. It's interesting. So it was written before the Obergefell decision, which was in 2015. But in this essay, he basically says that the gay rights issue, same-sex marriage is not just a moral issue, it's a cosmological issue. The gay rights cause has succeeded precisely because the Christian cosmology has dissipated in the minds of the West. One point that's made is that he's quoting a lady who was a classicist at Yale, that Paul's teachings, we read those things in the Old Testament, and people often cite them as being restrictive and overly moralistic. And what this lady wrote, her name was Sarah Redden, I think, like I said, a class at Yale, was that originally these were liberating. Paul's writings about marriage and sexual purity were liberating in the culture of the time, which was pornographic and sexually exploitative, especially towards women. So sex is a lot more complicated than we may recognize. Oh, here's a little thing interesting from the Weekend Pictures. So now the Apple pregnant man emoji is available in every skin color, so everybody can be confused about biology. I really like this one. This was an ad actually that was put out by KLM Airlines, Royal Dutch Airlines, in 2017 to celebrate Pride Day or week, whatever they had. And this is what it said: it doesn't matter who you click with. But when you look at it, you know what? It actually does matter who you click with. In fact, two of those couples don't work. This was heavily criticized on Twitter. I'm not on Twitter, but apparently even by gay people who said, this is the stupidest thing I've ever seen. But they just couldn't, recognize it. How about this? So salvation and sanctification in the light of creation and restoration. I was talking about creation and restoration being heavily emphasized in the program. So what about people? So we know that, I used to teach this all the time to the kids in BSF. Jesus Christ is fully human and fully God. And it's a really hard concept to wrap your brain around. Oftentimes we emphasize Jesus as fully God, but we need to remember the fully humanity part. So I'm never going to be God. I'm never going to be that much like God. There's some ways in which I can do certain things. I can think, I can do this. He's creative. I can be creative, but I can be sanctified. But I'm being sanctified to conform to the image of Christ. And I think I'm going to be a lot closer to being conformed to the image of Christ as fully human. So what if he didn't come to save us from our humanity, but to our humanity, what God purposed originally? I really love that idea. So here's 4 questions to ask. This is actually my last slide. These questions were asked for us to consider as we were going to think about our 3-year project or 3-year mission plan. But Christians have always, throughout history, have looked to answer these questions in certain ways, and I'll try to give some examples. So what's good that we can celebrate and protect? Well, right now we might say human life. By the way, Christians have done this from the beginning in being protective of human life. Not only do we know that during illnesses like plagues throughout history, Christians have been willing to put their own lives at risk to care for the sick, but because knowing that that all people have the image of God, and human life is good and sacred, but that they're in a way, but that another thing in the early Roman church days, Christians distinguished themselves because Romans discarded babies in the trash, living babies that were still alive. They threw them out in the trash, especially baby girls. And the Christians would find them and rescue them and raise them. And this was very influential in Roman society, that the Christians behaved like this. So what's missing that we can contribute? I think of the book by I can't think of Mangalati, whatever, from India that he spoke.
Mangalati.
Yeah, thank you. Remember how hospitals, schools, all these various things that, of course, now they've become secularized, but originally were started as in Christian purposes. What's evil that we can resist? Well, how about William Wilberforce himself in resisting the slave trade, and it took almost to the end of his life before he was successful. Or maybe how about Bonhoeffer resisting Nazism? Or there's evil today that we can resist. I think about the book that Roger wrote, Live Not by Lies, right? And what's broken that we can restore? Families, relationships, institutions in our culture. All of these places are places where we as Christians can participate in God's restorative work in our culture. So that's it for my presentation. I'm gonna cut that off, come back to the group. And now I'm ready to hear comments, and as I once heard Steve Martin say, fend off questions.
Paul, for those of us who
Listen,
missed
Mary.
the first few minutes, can you just very, very briefly recap your first several minutes of your presentation?
Let's see, where did you come in? What was I talking about?
Worldviews.
Yeah, so I talked about the Colson program and a little bit about the history. It's a growing program, and the goal is that people would spend time studying Christian worldview, have an understanding of it and culture, and then with the idea of being trained to speak and talk to other people about things, interact and recognize the false teachings that are out there and why we should oppose them, and then finding our place to sort of answer those 4 questions that were there at the end.
Mhm.
That's the goal of the program. Is we're being sent out on a mission. We're not graduating. And I pointed out it's a growing program. Just to illustrate, 20 in Atlanta basically last year and 40 this year.
Mhm.
It's 750 people in the world last year did it. There'll be more this year. Books.
Was there anything in particular that was really illuminating to you, something you'd never really thought about before?
I think that slide where I was talking about sex
Mhm.
and all of the ways that it's gotten so much more complicated. Yeah, I never thought about human sexuality as being related to theology and
Mhm.
cosmology and that sort of thing.
Mhm.
Not at all. For me, I guess, especially having, a medical degree and that sort of thing, it's been biological. But now we see that even biology is confused about that. So I can't imagine what it would be like to be in medical school nowadays.
Mhm.
Terminology they would use to try to get around the fact that only women can have babies.
Everything's been politicized.
Exactly.
And remember that too, you don't have to take the Hippocratic Oath anymore. Think about that, how that decreases morality in the profession.
Yeah.
And I have a question for you, Paul. Would you call Colson Center post-millennial or amillennial belief system?
Yes, yeah. So, that's a good question, because I sort of noticed that there's not they don't take a strong stance on that, but they're not premillennial. That's one thing I noticed. That because there's something, if you're premillennial, you have a mindset that everything's getting worse and someday Jesus is going to come back and fix it all, right? The idea of God being at work in a restorative way along the way is not heavily emphasized. So as somebody who thinks more in terms of premillennial terms than the people maybe some of the people I was surrounded with and were being taught by, I recognize that there is truth in what they're saying. I'm not taking a hard stance on, premillennial, postmillennial, amillennial. But I know that without actually declaring himself, I heard John Stonestreet say one time when he gave a talk. It was a very interesting talk. He called it Benny Kuiper. And the idea was he was trying to reconcile the Benedict option to Kuiper's teachings. And anyway, in that talk, so that's where he was giving that talk where he did his master's degree. And he said, he talked about, without saying specifically about what his view was, he said that he paid a lot of money to that school to get an opinion to that question. So that is a very good question, Mary. But yes, you're keen to point out that there's not a heavy emphasis on premillennialism.
In any sort of official capacity, or you just sort of assume that from a few random comments?
No, they don't stress that. The main thing that they're stressing, you just have to, they're not putting a name on it, you see. The main thing that they are stressing is that God is at work today restoring his creation, and that we can play a role in it. Well, we're definitely called to do some things, right? So I have no issues with that. And I can, as somebody who's maybe leans personally being more premillennial, I have no qualms in playing a role in doing things that God has called us to do in this world, in accordance with those 4 questions that they asked.
And Paul, if I may speak up for a moment, actually,
yeah.
Hi, good job, by the way, congratulations.
So let me just say, Shelley, who's speaking now, she was one of my leaders last year, and she did the program the year before. So I'll be interested to hear what she has to say.
No, I just was going to comment briefly on the amillennial, premillennial, postmillennial. So Paul is correct in that is not a stance that the Colson Fellows comes out and takes a hard line on, specifically because you think about the number of individuals that Paul just mentioned has gone through the program over the years since it transitioned from the Centurion to the Colson Center. All of these individuals have come from vastly diverse theological backgrounds, which is a beautiful thing, because the whole point is that we come together in community and we learn from one another. And that as we do so, we're not discoursing about specific, like we're not talking about the differences between Baptist and Lutheran and
Right.
Methodist. We're talking about the cultural perspective of how we as Christ followers can impact the sphere of influence in which God has placed us in. So that actually each one of the true leaders of Colson Fellows, if you actually sit down and talk with each one of them, specifically Dr. Bill Brown, Michael Craven, John Stonestreet, they actually all believe different things about the millennial perspective. But they can all agree, and we agree as a Colson Fellows program, that regardless of pre, mid, post, that we are placed here for a purpose and a reason, and that is to reflect, 1, the light of Christ, but 2, that we influence culture in such a way that we are pointing people, 1, we give a reason for the hope that's found within us, but 2, we're pointing people to the truth, to the reality of this is God's word. This transforms and changes culture as you share that. So I hope that helps.
Thank you. Very well said, Shelley. Thank you.
I think it's interesting
Other
that they're
comments or
focusing
questions?
Go ahead.
on the churches. They're starting church programs that will be going in. I think there's a real need in our congregations to be aware of the cultural moment in which we're living. And then, as Paul emphasized, certainly in schools, it was very refreshing to see at the Wilberforce weekend a number of young people, probably seniors in high school, being commissioned to go forth. So I hope that maybe Mount Bethel, and I know Coley's on from Romania, even some of the students there. It would be wonderful to see that next generation equipped in a program such as this.
Yeah, so what she's saying is that, like I was pointing out, there's different ways you can do the program. And in addition to the online version and the cohort, which is based in a geographical location, that's a city, they're developing ones where a church says, we want to have one at our church. And the program, they will help with trying to get enough leaders to have programs like that. Now, we do meet at a church in the Atlanta cohort. We meet at the Church of the Apostles. Just that's because that's where Drew, our leader, goes to church, and so do a fair number of our participants and leaders. But that's just because they know about it. So we're trying to spread the word. We're trying to be evangelical regarding this program, which I think is a really great program. It fills a need. I think a lot of people, as I think about the way it's growing, it's addressing, people are becoming more aware, I think, of some of these issues, and it's meeting a need that people want to have a better understanding and be able to speak with other people about these issues, and then play a role in helping where they see bad things happening or something they can address.
Mhm. Yeah, and Paul, I think I've mentioned before that our upcoming fall seminar with the Areopagus is How Should We Now Live? A seminar in cultural apologetics. And part 1 deals with the life and legacy of Francis Schaeffer. And I think along with C.S. Lewis, Francis Schaeffer is probably one of the 2 most influential Christian thinkers of the 20th century. And but unlike C.S. Lewis, Schaeffer is gradually fading away in the consciousness of most people. So we hope to help resurrect his worldview teaching, and he's sometimes referred to as the father of modern cultural apologetics. So something we're very much looking forward to. So if the first year was essentially an overview, introduction to worldview, worldview thinking, worldview analysis, perhaps you covered this in the first few minutes, but is there a basic theme for the second year?
No, there's not a second year.
Oh, I thought it was a 3-year program.
No. That's the 3-year plan that you take, your personal sort of mission plan that you take out of the program.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
So no, it's you missed the part at the beginning where I talked about the sort of the 4 quarters, I guess you would say, even though it's 10 months of the program, starting with talking about worldview, and then cultural, what culture is. So, and then the third aspect was sort of hot spots in culture, things like racial relations, social justice, human sexuality, all those kinds of things. And finally, forming a cultural response, which is basically the time in which you are supposed to be thinking about your own, the gifts that God has gifted you with, your skills, the way you are. You actually take a test, an online test, to help you understand yourself better. So what I learned about myself was that I enjoy accumulating knowledge and sharing it with others. So you've allowed me to do that this evening. So yeah, and the reason that one of the main reasons I'm coming back to be a leader with the group is because there's just so much material. It's so interesting, even though I read everything, watched everything, and watched a lot of things twice. I'm still watching some of those things. I watched some of those things in preparation for this evening's talk, and I learned some things that I sort of missed the first time. And of course, they're always making a few modifications to the curriculum. So I'm not required to read all of those things, but I will be helping people get through the program. But just being immersed in that atmosphere of people learning and talking about these topics is something that I think I really want to be a part of.
And Janet, I believe, has a comment or question. Janet, you're muted presently.
But your hand's up.
Sorry. I have a question. I am a high school teacher in public education. Is there a good resource? I find so many of I usually have some from 9th Lit into American Lit. So I see them progress from a 9th grader to American Lit. And some are very confused about their sexuality, and they want to experiment. Is there a good resource for me to read to learn how to speak with them more about the Christian worldview in regards to sexuality? I mean, I know it's pretty simple. God created man, male and female, but how to converse with people, teenagers in particular.
Yeah. Let me think. Shelley, if you can think of something.
Oh, Nancy Piercy's most
that's-
recent book.
Right, okay.
Let me. check
Yes,
that.
because she spoke about it at when she came for the forum. That's a good idea. There, while he's looking that up, there is a good book that I know of that doesn't totally address. It's not focused on sexuality, but a book that we had to read called "Practical Guide to Culture" by John Stone Street and Brett Kunkel. When I read that book, I felt like this is something that should be read and used by, I was thinking parents of high school age kids, but teachers as well. It probably would be helpful to you. It has some things about sexuality in there, and actually, I know they probably can't do this, but there's a student version.
Maybe Paul, the Carl Truman's new book.
Yeah, well, I haven't read it yet. The one about Strange New World.
Yes, I haven't read it either, but it
Yes.
seems, I've heard that he addresses a lot about sexuality in there.
Right. So it's hard for me to recommend something I haven't read, but I'm just knowing who he is, and it's on our curriculum this year. I bet it's really good.
Okay. I just find it so
Nan-
sad that people are so, especially teenagers, they're so focused on sexuality and think that identifies who they are.
Yeah,
It's very heartbreaking
exactly.
that we're so much more than that.
And I think Jeffrey's right. Jeffrey, go ahead, because I remember.
Yeah,
I haven't read this book, but
like
addresses your
all of her
questions.
books, this one is brilliant. It's Love Thy Body, Nancy Piercy. And the subtitle is Answering Hard Questions About Life and Sexuality. And
Okay.
Nancy's an excellent writer.
Thank you.
And I read most of this book. In fact, we had Nancy in for an Areopagus forum about, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago. And you can access that, by the way, our forum videos. So
Yeah, that's probably good.
it would be excellent.
Okay, thank you.
And just getting back to the subtitle of the book that I mentioned, Practical Guide to Culture, just to give you an idea. Its subtitle is Helping the Next Generation Navigate Today's World. So it's not totally devoted to human sexuality. It talks about a lot of topics.
Paul, can I add something?
Go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, on perhaps a bit more historical perspective, was a book by a man named Carl Truman called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And he sort of, I don't know, he actually sets the book up this way, but it's sort of like saying, it's as if he said, why was it that if 25 or 30 years ago, someone had came forward and said, I feel like I'm a man trapped in a woman's body, or I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, we would have said, well, go get psychiatric help and to fix yourself, you know? And now we turn the entire society upside down to try to make this seem like it's something which is not just ordinary in the course of things, or something which we should be applauding, if you will, right? And so it's, as I said, it's called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. It's a bit academic, but it talks about where this has come from. It goes all through all the Sigmund Freud and all these people, and how the idea of what it means to be a person has changed so much over the years, and has arrived at what Janet was actually saying. We accept these weird concepts of what it means to be a person that have no grounding in reality anymore. They've been grounded in sort of, I don't know, perverse sociological and psychological theory. So I would recommend it.
Yeah. So
Like Jeffrey, I haven't finished the book, but it's absolutely wonderful.
It's a big book. I haven't read it. I thought it might be on our curriculum for this year, but it wasn't. But like I said, his shorter book called Strange New World is on the curriculum. So
good.
He's a very deep thinker about these topics. Millie and I have heard him.
Who is the author?
Carl Truman, Trueman.
Okay, thank you.
He's British.
He's at Grove City College, which is, of course, one of the highlights, if you will, of the Christian academic world these days, along with what's the one I can't think, Hillsdale and others, you know.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah, and Strange New World, I've read both. So Strange New World is basically a synopsis of the rise and triumph of the God itself. So similar to Paul referenced John Paul II's Theology of the Body, and Christopher West, which is a book that we read last year. Christopher West pretty much wrote a synopsis, which is our bodies tell God's story. Well, it's the same. So the Strange New World, even though it's written by the same author called Truman, Strange New World is a synopsis of the rise and triumph of the modern self. So if you don't want to slug through all of the academic aspects of the rise and triumph of the modern self, Strange New World would be.
I'll take you at your word. That would probably be a good way, because this is a bit of an academic, it's not an academic tone, but it's a bit,
No,
it's
he's
a bit more than most people want to
You
know.
ever
about
listen
the
to him
topic.
talk? He's somebody when he makes says a sentence, you have to listen or think about it for quite a while. He's very deep, right? It's so yeah.
Also, there's no better critique of all of this transgender and associated sexual confusion than the 3 or 4 minute scene in the Monty Python movie, The Life of Brian. Paul, you were over and we watched that a few weeks ago. You and Millie were over. And only about 4 minutes. It is absolutely brilliant. There is not a better critique, in a humorous vein, by the way, it's Monty Python, than that scene in that movie.
Okay.
Well, any other comments or questions before we close things out?
Hey, Paul, this is John Souders. Jeffrey, how y'all doing?
Oh, hey.
Yeah.
Ron?
Hey.
So thank you for going through that and answering some of the questions. I was interested in that. You mentioned that it's a 10-month thing. Does it start in the fall? Does it go during?
Yeah, I should have mentioned it starts in July.
Okay, gotcha.
It ends basically, you're finished with it. It sort of tapers off towards the end to allow you time to finish, and basically ends in April. But there's not as much in the way. It's not. Most of your assignments are before that, so fewer assignments in April, and then the Wilberforce weekend where you're commissioned is in May.
Okay.
And we also had the week before that in early May, local commissioning.
Okay.
Where Michael Craven, who's one of the vice presidents of the organization, came from Texas to speak to us here and to he passed out we walked across the stage and he handed us a little something. We got the real thing in Orlando though.
Okay.
People might want to know, and for John and anyone else, Paul mentioned the time, and then I believe it's $750. Is that correct, Paul?
900.
Oh, 900. Okay. And this year's class is full in Atlanta,
Right.
John,
Yeah, I
or
mentioned
anyone
that.
else, but now is a good time to start thinking ahead till next year if you're
Okay.
really interested.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
it is.
I guess just one point I was going to make as well is just as you were going through this and talking about your 3-year plan, and one thing I noticed everyone kind of talked on different comments about the craziness, the emphasis on sexuality, and a lot of that is because of worldview. As an atheist or somebody that's taught that we're just an evolved animal, then that's going to be something important to you, and you don't see any love higher than that. But as you were going through this, to what extent did you have, I hate to say it this way and sound sexist, but we're talking politically incorrect anyway with a Christian worldview. I've noticed that it seems like if the father's not involved in the home pushing this with their children, any discipleship program will fail. So what extent do they encourage people in this program to take this into their families first or into churches and get those people involved with teaching their children, as the Lord says we should do?
Well, yeah, like I said, there is an emphasis on the way things should be. And so, yes, families with a mother and a father. And I'm trying to understand exactly what you're asking,
I guess
what people want.
What extent is this something that we could, for example, at Johnson Fair right now, discipleship is a big push. And of course, they had to give it I think like 319 or 419 groups to make it trendy. But in reality, I went and met with the pastor and said, hey, if you want to make it fail, I can help. just make sure the dads aren't involved. If it's not being pushed from the father, who's supposed to be the spiritual leader within his family, these things are going to fail. And I wonder to what extent is what you've learned through this 10 months. Is there some way you can help push that into different churches locally to get the dads involved with leading their families the way they should?
Okay. So you're giving me a suggestion for part of my 3-year plan. I mean, what you're describing is definitely, worthy of it. It answers one of those questions: what's missing that should be right. That's just not where I, that was not where I felt called to do something. But you know what? Let me just suggest that, maybe you should do the program and then make that part of your 3-year plan. If you have a passion for that. Really, they're trying to, but I understand that there's definite need for that. And I completely agree. As far as individuals, 3-year plans, they don't tell you what you should do. They're very flexible about those things, but they want you to be serious about what you're doing, and they guide you, get advice. You're mentored through the decision process, and like I said, you take a test to give you an idea of what your skill set is, and you develop your own sort of personal mission statement.
Okay.
Well, Paul, thank you very much. That was very enlightening. Excellent presentation, excellent slides. And thanks to all of those who joined us this evening. And so if you feel so led, which hopefully you will, follow up on a lot of these themes that were introduced by Paul this evening. So again, thank you very much. Great session. Appreciate all the time and thought that went into this.
Sure. Well, you're welcome. And thank you, all of you who were in attendance. And I appreciate all of the support in answering the questions, and those of you who asked questions or had comments, thank you. And again, if anybody has any questions about the program, if they're interested, I'll be happy to answer those questions. So you can contact me, no problem. I'd love to do it.
Well, thank you. And good evening to all of you. Blessings on the rest of your week. And we're very much looking forward to our session next week. Donna Weeks will be speaking on my spiritual pilgrimage, not mine, but hers, her spiritual pilgrimage from the new age to new life in Christ. A great topic. And so Donna, we're very much looking forward to that with great anticipation. Thanks. Well, good evening. Thanks for joining us.